I am here with Marcel Dixon. You ran for Congress against Jim Clyburn in the 6th Congressional District in the recent partisan primaries. You have a very interesting background. Your family has a very long history in South Carolina, and you're fighting for some unique issues. I'm very excited to be able to talk with you today about your past, what brought you into politics, and what you hope to see change in the future.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation.
So for folks that don't know, can you talk a little bit about your family's background in the South Carolina Low Country?
Yeah, so my family is Gullah or Geechee, as some people like to say, or Sea Island Creole, which is the term that is used by many anthropologists, meaning we are descendants of the rice-growing Africans that were enslaved on the Sea Islands of South Carolina and Georgia primarily, but also a little bit of northern Florida and North Carolina. So we are the people that generated the first source of immense wealth for the British colonies, which people always think of cotton. It was actually rice and indigo, and that was grown and cultivated by us. We did the irrigation. We had the know-how of growing and cultivating rice because it was and still is a huge staple of the diet in many West and Central African civilizations and society. And it's a huge, huge staple. It's probably the main staple in the Gullah Geechee diet, from red rice to dirty rice to hoppin' john or peas and rice, or South Carolina peas and rice, as they call it, to purloo, to what's the other dish? We have so many rice dishes here, to rice pudding, to all types of rice dishes. We eat it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. My family has been here since I've been able to go to the mid 1700s. I'm pretty sure we've been here since before then. So on my mother and father's side, right here on the coast of South Carolina, a little bit of Georgetown County, a little bit of Charleston County, but mainly Beaufort County and later on Jasper County, because Jasper County didn't exist until the early 1900s. It was mainly Beaufort County.
So you can track your family long back through that lineage.
Yes, we have a graveyard, matter of fact, in Bluffton, South Carolina. It used to be called Pinckney's Colony, but we have a graveyard still on Pinckney Colony Drive in Bluffton that has some of my ancestors buried there up until the early 1800s. So I'm Gullah Geechee, or Sea Island to the core, which I'm very proud of being.
That's awesome.
I'm trying to teach myself the language. I mean, no one really, well, the older people still actually speak the language. You know, I know he's a controversial figure, but Clarence Thomas, who's from Pinpoint, an island right off the coast of Savannah, Georgia, his first language was Gullah. He had to learn English later on in his life. So there are older people like Clarence Thomas who still speaks the language. I want to learn the language, but we have our own cuisine, as I talked about a little. We have our own folk magic, which some people call hoodoo, or we usually call root in our area. We have our own style of music, the ring shout. We have a pretty unique Southern accent. I mean, it's part ways typical Southern accent, and some people will say partially sounds like a little bit of what you might hear in the Caribbean. Some people compare it to the accent you will hear in the Louisiana Bayou. We have our own style, our own family traditions, our own social traditions. People usually gather around a barbecue, as white Southerners tend to say. We Black Southerners tend to say cookout, but we tend to have what's called a calabash or low country boils. So it's a very unique subculture of the South. We're not as well known as the Louisiana Creole subculture, but we like it that way because we don't want someone trying to commercialize and then whitewash our culture, which tends to happen when it becomes very popular.
Yeah, it's been something that I grew up in Massachusetts and I moved here to go to college, and learning about that culture. I mean, I didn't know anything about it growing up. I just wasn't taught about it in school, didn't really see it on TV or anything. But Chef BJ Dennis, I don't know if you're aware of him, but he lives in the Charleston area and he does a lot of awesome stuff on social media. And I've learned so much following him. And of course, I've seen him on TV since then.
They also have the TV show Gullah Gullah Island.
Who runs that? Where can people watch that?
The TV show Gullah Gullah Island. You ever seen it? With it's a kids show, but Ron Diaz and his wife, I forgot her name, Mrs. Diaz, they did Gullah Gullah Island on Nickelodeon. But yeah, Chef BJ Dennis, He's doing a lot of great things, keeping Gullah Geechee culture and cuisine, which is a part of the culture, at the forefront.
So talk about your childhood. I was reading on your campaign website that you grew up in a household with, I think you were taken care of by your great grandparents. At a point in time, you had many members of your family living with you. Kind of what was that like growing up in that community?
Well, it's very idyllic. I don't know. I hate to say that because people tend to think that every child thinks their childhood was idyllic. No, that is not the case at all. I have been a teacher for 17 years, and I can tell you there are many, 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 many kids who know that their childhood is filled with trauma and pain. My childhood was quite idyllic. I grew up in a household with several generations. My great grandmother, okay, not my grandmother, my great grandmother, my grandmother, my grand my uncle, my two aunts, my two older brothers, my younger sister, my cousins, Omega and Kareem. Who else was in the household? My God, it was so many of us at different times. My father was there till he and my mother divorced. And right next door was my great grand aunt, Aunt Nancy, and her husband, my uncle Eli. They had 13 kids, and several of them still lived there. So it was their cousins. It was at least a good 7 or 8 of them. And then next door to my Aunt Nancy was my other great grand aunt, who is still alive, by the way, Aunt Rena, she's the person, my great grandmother did all the food. My Aunt Rena did all the folklore. She would tell us stories about Dr. Buzzard, South Carolina's very infamous root doctor. She would tell us stories about superstitions, and it was her children and their kids and their cousins. So it was a plethora of my cousins, my great grandmother's home, my great grand aunts and their children. Now, funny, must know, my great grand aunts were not the sisters of my great grandmother. Those were her sister-in-laws. They still considered her to be their sister, but they were my great grandfather's sisters. But he moved up north, like a lot of Black Americans from the South did. In South Carolina, the Great Migration, most went to New York City and Philadelphia, and he never came back south. My great grandmother did. I remember fighting with my cousins most of the time. We fought each other, but if anyone came to that little slice of the Low Country that we own, which is now prime real estate, they ran us off right there on Highway 170, going from Ridgeland into Bluffton. It's called Cherry Point, or sometimes Pearlstein. And now Okatee Elementary is across the street. When we were growing up, ain't none of that was there. Now they're trying to call it Okatee. It was not called Okatee when we were growing up. It was just Ridgeland. When all the poor Blacks were there, I guess nobody wanted to claim it. Now that it's prime real estate, they gave it a new little cute name, Okatee, and they make it seem like it's not a part of Ridgeland. But I remember on Friday nights, at the end of the work week, all my cousins and I, and let me tell you, it was not perfect, but I do remember we used to light fires in the steel barrels and roast crabs or boil crabs and, see who had the most meat on their crab. Play baseball in the field. That field is still there. My Aunt Rena is still alive. That has the billboard. Matter of fact, that billboard is very expensive to get because it's right on Highway 170. We used to play baseball there. We built our little tree houses in the back. And what's funny? The adults didn't really always speak to each other a lot. It's like the adults stayed in their home. My great grandmother would speak to my Aunt Rena a lot, but the adults didn't really speak to each other an awful lot. But the kids, we were with each other, going to the graveyards. It's a Gullah Geechee tradition. I didn't know it at the time. We would always go and clean the graveyards and do a new floral arrangement. I didn't realize that was a Gullah Geechee practice. It used to be a part of a second line we used to have. The second line has unfortunately died out, but doing the floral arrangements on the graveyard, I will go with my cousin Rosina and my cousin Vern, and we would go and clean and sweep the graveyards. It was, I'm not a nostalgic person, not at all. I believe our best days are still ahead of us, but those were good times, if I must admit. But they were filled with pain too.
So you kind of touched on the good times, and that does sound like an amazing childhood. I mean, I don't know too many people who, especially in modern society, in the 21st century, get to grow up around so many members of their family. I think that's a beautiful thing that you got to experience that. I was also reading, about the impact that drugs had on some members of your family, on some members of your community. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Sure. My mother, and it still bothers her to this day, my mother's father died from a heroin overdose. People don't realize, but the CIA was implicit in either actually placing heroin first, then crack later on, but heroin definitely in urban areas, the majority Black urban areas, mainly Baltimore and New York City. And unfortunately, my mother's father was a casualty of heroin. He died when she was 6 years old. It still haunts her to this day. My mother said that's the reason why she took to my father, because my father, his mother, my grandmother, she was severely hooked on drugs as well. And he was being raised by his great grandparents, my great grandparents. They were born in the late 1800s. They died. The last one, I don't know, it was my great grandfather, my great grandmother, Miss Irene or Mr. Powell, but one of them died right when my second oldest brother, Lamont, was born in 1982. And my father grew up in abject poverty. My mother told me, you see, my mother is a product of the reverse migration, Black Americans moving back to the South, which if you follow the news, South Carolina is one of the states that's seeing a boom in this Black population from the reverse migration. Everyone gives attention to North Carolina and Georgia, but South Carolina, the second fastest growing group after old white retirees from the North, places like Massachusetts, your home, is Black
My parents will
Americans
be
who are
joining that.
returning to their Southern roots. Right. So my great grandmother moved up north to New York City. My great grandfather followed her. But my grandmother was born in New York City. She had some heartbreak there with my grandfather, who was not my biological grandfather. He was the man she fell in love with after my mother's father died. And she moved south. And my mother was in her early teens. And she said when she moved there in the 70s, people didn't have running water, electricity, you know, having a telephone or a television was an amenity and a luxury that many didn't enjoy. Well, that was my father. My father didn't have, he had running water, he had electricity, but television, no. Telephone, no. Air condition, no. My great grandparents, these were people born in the late 1800s. They didn't know how to relate to a kid who was 3 generations removed from them, who was born in the 60s and raising him as a teenager in the 70s. So they felt that as long as he had something to eat and had clothes on his back, he was good. A lot of those clothes were hand-me-downs. You know, he almost grew up as if he was being raised on a farm. But at this time, you know, pop culture, Black pop culture was really taking off. Muhammad Ali, you know, soul music, you know, guitar rock, James Brown and Barry White and Shaka Khan. So everyone was getting into fashion. The Black is Beautiful movement was taking off, and here he was wearing hand-me-downs. So he was bullied. He grew up in a lot of poverty. He was lonely because apparently my grandmother was trying to get herself clean, and she came down south and asked my brother my father and his brother if they wanted to move up north with them. And he was afraid of the big city because my great grandparents, being people who had lived in South Carolina since the late 1800s, an agrarian life, they feared the big city. So my father told her no, but my uncle, his younger brother, said yes. And she took my uncle, but not my father, and that just emotionally destroyed my father. So my mother and my father bonded over both having parent issues. My mother always being bothered by not having her biological father around, and my father being bothered that he didn't know his real father. He would find out later on when I was a young baby, but at the time didn't know him, and then not having his mother. And they bonded. So pain brought them together. And unfortunately, it would be pain that would separate them. My father eventually took on a lot of the traits that my grandmother had. He became severely hooked to drugs. And even though he was happy to have finally had a family, he found a warmth. Not saying my great grandparents were not loving. He always said that they took care of him, but they just didn't know how to relate to him. He found that in my mother's family. He also, you know, kind of came into his own groove. And as a result of that, he cheated on my mother's all the time. severely hooked on drugs. He even told me he was extremely disrespectful to my mother. And she put up with it a lot because she wanted us to have what she didn't have. And it wasn't just that. My granduncle, my uncle Jerome, was a veteran. I don't know, I think he served in the Korean War. And he came back severely hooked on drugs, Parkinson, and unfortunately, he was there when my mother's father died, and he left my mother's father there on the ground when he had a heroin overdose, and it haunted him, haunted him. He never mentally recovered. So can you imagine? My grandmother took in her brother, my uncle Jerome, when his mind was just deteriorating because of drug overdose and guilt from letting her first love die. So you can imagine all the emotional complexities that existed within my household. And my great grandmother, she was able to buy homes. Okay. She had property. She moved back south to take care of my grandmother, only to find out that land she purchased. This was a woman who was born in 1914, who saw Jim Crow, who saw lynch mob, who saw Black Wall Streets, because more than just one being burnt to the ground. He bought land in Beaufort for a very small amount in today's value, only to come back and see that the government had done to her what they had did to a lot of Black communities and still do, put a highway through her property. She died never, ever, ever being able to get that land. So there were a lot of issues, from drug use, from guilt, from anti-Black racism, from death, a lot of issues that were at the surface. And soon I will come into my own issues. I was severely bullied in middle school by two boys in particular, one in particular. I was sexually taken advantage of. I talk about it openly because a lot of guys, Black guys are, but Black men, we are looked at as being cool and being strong and not crying. Only emotions we're supposed to show is sexual desire, arrogance, and bravado. So I am humanizing Black men in the eyes of the media because we are human and if any group, any demographic in this country has been through hell and pain and abuse as a man and deserves to have compassion, is Black men. I moved away, wanted to go to a private school, and I thought it would be a good change for me. It was awful being away from my mother, being away from my community, and that just led to a downward spiral for me, emotionally speaking.
But it seems like you had some years there where you didn't quite know what your purpose was. You said that you were selling cars, you were doing some other jobs at that time, but you eventually ended up substitute teaching and kind of found your passion.
When I came back when I was in Atlanta, I experienced, now I'm old enough to realize what it was. It was extreme homesickness. And that led to the onset of depression. Be honest with you, I speak to my father, and some of the things I told him that I went through and things I thought, he said he used to have those same thoughts and used to say those same things to himself. So I think I inherited it from my father, but it was, being away from my community was probably the worst thing ever. And if I could go back in time, this is why I'm not a nostalgic person, because I like to leave the past in the past. I'm always trying to address and heal from the pain in the past. So I try not to focus on it. When I came back, things were different. I was back in my community, but things were not the same. My cousin, Kanisha, who was born just 4 days after me, we were like this, just like my older brother, Lamont, had my cousin, Lamar. They were born around the same time, 4 days later. They were like this. So my cousin, Kanisha, we were the pair. She had, grown to her own identity and had like another friend now, and I hadn't moved on yet. And shortly thereafter, the government did what they always do to Black communities. They widened Highway 170, and we had two choices. We can stay there and literally have the highway on our porch. And while we were staying there will be bad accidents. So it will really put us in danger. So my great grandmother was pretty much coerced into selling the property. And my mother didn't seem to mind. I don't think, like I said, the adults didn't always mingle like that. But for me, it was pretty much perpetuating the loneliness I felt in Atlanta. So yeah, my identity was usurped from me. So yeah, after school, like a lot of people in schools that are troubled, I didn't have a plan. No one sat down with me and came up with a career and a future. My mother always felt like college would be, not necessary because she was a teenage parent and she had people who were college educated working for her as a store manager. Okay. And she would have people working under her. So yeah, I sold cars. I worked at a hospital, Hilton Head Island Regional. I'm not even sure that's what it's still called. I worked there for a while in the kitchen. And then I started substitute teaching because I left the hospital job and needed something to do. So I started working as a substitute in the school district, Jasper County School District, where I was educated.
So I cover a lot of education issues for our website, FITSNews. I primarily focus on schools in the Midlands region just because we're based out of Irmo, which is right next to Lake Murray, kind of in the Columbia area. But obviously, if there's, we have a statewide reach. So if there's stories anywhere in the state, we cover them. But can you talk a little bit about what those schools are like, both when you're growing up and what they're like now?
When I was growing up, the schools were desperately resource deprived. The buildings were decrepit. However, it was a little bit more of a community feeling because Ridgeland was then, not as much now, a pretty small community, and most people there knew each other. And the teachers there were tasked with overcoming the issues that society has yet to solve, which is so unfair. There's a lot of poverty, a lot of children coming from homes that were afflicted by drugs in one way or the other. Either someone in their community was selling drugs to try to escape poverty, or someone in their community was using drugs, or both. It has only gotten worse. The thing is now, though, we've had an influx of people who are not born and raised here, and they've come with their own set of issues. It's still resource deprived, okay? In the main issue, and I talk about this in a lot of my interviews, is the way America funds schools. If you are in a community like Bluffton, which is the richest town in South Carolina, your property taxes, which is how schools are funded, is going to be very, 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 very sufficient to meet all your needs. If you're in a poor community like Ridgeland, the property tax revenue is much, much smaller, and you're going to be resource deprived just from that alone. But there's more. Yes, kids in wealthy communities have issues too, whether it comes from emotional, mental issues, not being able to get access to the support they need. Drugs exist there too, violent homes exist there too, dysfunction exists there too, transportation issues exist there too. But if you go to a poor community, that's not the exception, that's the norm. Instead of having a few kids who are afflicted by not having enough to eat, not having AC in the summer, not having heat in the winter, being afflicted by mental and emotional issues, but not being able to afford to get help for your mental, emotional, and physical ailments. That becomes the norm. And teachers are still trying to deal with kids who have behavioral issues as a result of mental and emotional trauma. They're trying to deal with kids who come to school cold during the winter or dehydrated during the summer. They're trying to deal with kids who are malnourished. So they are there thinking, is my power going to be on when I get home? Am I going to have to move again when I get home? Is my mother safe because a boyfriend she has might be abusing her? Or am I going to see my mother because she has to work several jobs and take the bus to Hilton Head Island or sometimes Charleston? They are having to deal with kids who are in survival mode. So those kids cannot focus on the academic material. They're thinking about their basic survival, their basic needs. I have dealt with that. And not only that, a lot of kids come into the classroom, especially in communities like Jasper County, 20%. If you get 20 or 30% of the class that can read on grade level, you have done well, okay? I am proud, and I brag about this because I'm bragging about my students. I've had that every single year. Not once did I ever have a classroom where more than 30% of the kids were on grade level. But I am glad to say that every year I left the classroom, it will be 75% or more who were reading and writing on or above grade level. But it took a lot out of me. I'm no longer employed as a teacher. my current school decided to let me go for reasons that I don't understand because my record was stellar. I always received bonuses for my kids' performance every single year. When I took my kids to academic competitions like Model United Nations, we will be the blackest school there. I will have the highest percentage of girls on the team. We will be the least experienced team there. And yet every single time we will come back with an award. Twice we came back in second place. The only school that beat us was a school that had 5 coaches. The kids came in on air-conditioned buses, and their school had been participating for 40 years. And we will be a few points shy of beating them. So my record was stellar. I have letters of commendation from the state, but I still am sympathetic to the issues that teachers are facing. The issue is, Dylan, people are trying to solve issues that impact schools without solving issues that impact the communities that the kids who attend these schools have to face. That's the problem. If you want to solve the issues that impact schools, even what I offer to do is insufficient. Simply dealing with levels of funding, that is the tip of the iceberg. The bulk of the iceberg that is often underwater that people don't want to address is dealing with issues of family support, paying parents a livable wage, guaranteeing parents time off to attend parent-teacher conferences, making healthcare, mental, physical, and emotional free of charge and high quality, making childcare free of charge and high quality, fighting violence, to fight poverty. Those are the issues that will have the most impact in reforming and improving our schools in this nation. There's more, but those are the most
it's easy from like my perspective to cover an issue of, okay, somebody at the school board steals money from the school. That's an easy story to write, but a harder story to write is, okay, 30% of the kids in the school are coming in hungry. They didn't get breakfast. They're not going to have lunch. Like, how are you going to learn?
We've had kids all the time who will want to, I used to do this. A lot of teachers did this sometimes, and schools are getting better at this with the money, getting snacks for kids, breakfast and lunch, but that's insufficient. If you were like me, I don't know, you're from Massachusetts, so when you go into places like South Carolina, especially in the South, white Southerners and Black Southerners, but especially Black Southerners, we eat a lot. Okay, when my great grandmother would fix our food, people who were from other places would be like, that's a kid's plate? Yes, like my plate, you would have to carry it with 2 hands. It would be that heavy. So the kids here have big appetites. So when they used to give us snacks, some kids who didn't want their food, we would keep like a cache of snacks in our classrooms to give to kids when they went home because they were hungry. And first of all, let me make it clear. I am not slandering the parents of my community. Most parents of my community are good parents, hardworking, teach your kids to do what's right. But a lot of them are dealing with issues for which they did not get any support, okay? I am afraid of having a child if I ever have a child in this system, because I'll be afraid of my kid getting depression that I have and having to go through some of the emotional issues I face. And I am aware of that. And because I have a sort of a more educated background. Imagine parents who don't even realize, and this is even with people who are quote unquote educated. Some people are afflicted by mental and emotional issues, and they are not even aware they have it. And that is sometimes the reason why their kids struggle, and they may not be aware of it because they never got a support for their issue. That was the issue with my father. He never got support for the issues he faced. My mother was able to overcome her issues. She still faces them because she had a solid level of familial support. My father didn't have that. So as a result, my siblings and I, we all inherited some of his issues. That happens all the time. See, those are the issues that politicians are supposed to implement policies to address, and they have failed to do so. Why do you think South Carolina, and since you write about education, you obviously know about South Carolina's very, very much infamous corridor of shame, which refers to majority Black rural counties along Interstate 95. Okay, I think it starts with Marlborough County or Dillon County, comes all the way down here to Jasper County before you get into Chatham County, Georgia, in Savannah. The levels of poverty exceed 90% for the Black community alone, okay? Hampton, Jasper, over 80% of the Black community lives in poverty. I know that because all you have to do is what this country used to do. They stopped doing it like 2 or 3 years ago, but they used to use the U.S. Department of Agriculture's free and reduced lunch data to gauge the poverty level in a community. For the Black kids in Hampton County, Allendale County is almost 100%. In Jasper County, the number of the percentage of Black people living in poverty is over 90%. So of course, the rate of academic failure for Black boys is over 90%, for Black girls over 70%. This is not because these kids are not intelligent. It takes a lot of intelligence to survive what these kids have to survive. And I am proof that when these kids get a firm hand on them and they get someone who loves them like I did and still do, but I'm tough on them, I don't pull any punches with them, I hold them to high expectations, and I make no apologies for being tough on them, they will soar and excel. But it took a lot out of me. I have been sleeping since this campaign ended most of the day because I'm trying to recover. But it was like that every summer. If I had to work, it almost killed me. One time they found gray hair in my head, okay? It burns teachers out. So when we talk about why we can't find teachers, it's not just because of the low pay. It's not just because of student misbehavior. It's also because no good deed goes unpunished. The teachers that really pour themselves into their kids, sometimes they are targeted by predatory administrators. Sometimes they get backlash from the community. And sometimes it just takes too much from them to help their students and they get tired. We have to address those big overreaching issues that local politicians have failed to address, but especially federal politicians have failed to address. And they don't get called out for not doing it.
So you've brought up the local versus federal, and this is kind of a question that I had. You started your political career by running for a federal seat. What are your thoughts on the local elected representatives that you have for your community? Do you think that somebody should be running against them? And why did you choose to run for a U.S. Congress seat?
Here's the thing. You know, there's this saying that all politics is local. I always hated that saying. I get what it means, though. It means that a lot of people tend to underestimate local politics that actually can have a more immediate impact on our day-to-day lives. And people tend to only care about like the presidential election. However, I always retort, if all politics is local, then how come the local politicians don't get the big check? Okay? The federal politicians do. So when you have someone like a James Clyburn, who when you hold him accountable, he's quick to say, oh, that's a local issue. That's a local issue. Okay, but you get 6 figures. My local politicians get what, $20,000 a year, if that? And they often have to work full-time at another job while also serving their local community. I do feel that local politicians should do better. I'm very critical of some local politicians. However, we know the history of the US. You being from Massachusetts, one of the first states to abolish slavery, and me being a South Carolinian, when they started to desegregate schools, which, by the way, I have some probably unique views, which not really that unique if you talk to enough Black people on desegregation. But when they started to desegregate schools, some local communities refused to do so. South Carolina, which was one of the last states to desegregate. My mother came down here and schools were still segregated. That was in the mid-1970s, okay? The federal government intervened and said, you are going to desegregate. You are going to abolish this separate but equal system you have. When the local politicians fail or local governments have failed, it is incumbent upon the federal government to get involved. They've done that in many cases, whether it was with sexism, whether it was with segregation, whether it was with the abolition of slavery. When local communities refuse to do what's right, the federal government is supposed to intervene. The reason I ran federally, and I'm still running federally, is because I'm not just concerned about Black South Carolinians and South Carolinians in general. I want all people to get the things that this country can do and should have done a long time ago. If I ran locally and let's say people in my South Carolinian community were doing better, that's not enough for me, okay? We are in a crisis. And when I say we, Dylan, I'm really talking about Black Americans, not Black immigrants, Black Americans who are descendants of American slaves. We own less homes now than we did during Jim Crow, okay? In South Carolina, we have the worst quality of water in the US. North Charleston, the most toxic water. Denmark, South Carolina hasn't had clean water in over a decade, a majority Black town. Florence, South Carolina, they have to use solar filters in some churches to get clean water. North Charleston has the highest eviction rate in America. It's one of the highest gun rates in America. Right there in Columbia, South Carolina, more people get their arms and legs chopped off, amputated, than any other community in the US. And the majority of them are Black Americans, not because they're so unhealthy, but because they live in food deserts and healthcare deserts. But what is happening in South Carolina is happening throughout this country to Black Americans, okay? We have lost 90% of our land. Our wealth is actually going downward where every other group is going upward. So it's a crisis, and that's why I chose to run federally, and I still am. We have failed to hold federal officials accountable. You see, going back to that statement, all politics is local, there is one thing we tend to underestimate. We think about the president, and that's probably it. You know, maybe the mayor and maybe the governor, but we don't pay attention, and maybe the senators too. You know, people know Lindsey Graham, people know Tim Scott, but we don't pay attention to people that we put in the House of Representatives. They have a lot of power. Case in point, I'm Gullah Geechee. I'm sure you know how we've lost a lot of our coastal land here. They just did another article about it in the state newspaper. I believe that was the state newspaper or Post and Courier, about how we are still losing our land. 15 million acres gone from 1910 to 1997, and we're losing the 1 million acres we have left. South Carolina is ground zero. South Carolina is the state where most Black Americans still own land, okay? It's heirs property. So we don't get any value from it, we still own it. I have tons of land via heirs property in Beaufort, on the coast, in downtown Beaufort, you name it. However, we don't benefit from it, but we're losing it. James Clyburn wrote a bill to give the Catawba Native Americans, people talk about white Americans, a lot of Native Americans were slave owners too. Not only were the Catawba Native Americans enslavers, they were slave catchers. He wrote a bill to get them 20 acres of land. Where's his bill to help Black Americans get at least compensated for the land we have had stolen? He can do for us like he did for them, but he hasn't. But I promise you, if you ask the average South Carolinian about that, they have no idea it happened. They don't know that he did that for Native Americans, and they don't know that he should be and could do the same thing for us. So that's why I'm running. He needs to be held accountable. They call him a kingmaker. Excuse me. Well, I'm glad you and your family are living like kings. Yeah, I heard you've been taking donation money and giving it to your family members. So that explains a lot. I'm glad you and your family are living like kings. The rest of us should be living like royalty too, but that's not the case. We're living like peasants in feudal Europe.
Yeah, we actually reported on that story. That was a pretty interesting story. For folks who don't know, he basically set up a number of these campaign related vessels to take campaign funds and be able to distribute them to people in his life. And, you know, that we kind of care more when politicians waste taxpayer money than when they waste their donors' money, because, you know, we kind of view it as, listen, you're screwing over the people who have chosen to donate money to you. But it's very telling about somebody's character, the way that they treat the money that people choose to donate to them for the express use of a political campaign. They certainly don't expect you to try to funnel it back into the pockets of the people in your personal life.
It's disgusting. It's disgusting. He has become a millionaire since being in office for 30 years. Meanwhile, his district is the sixth, and I cannot say that statistic enough. I'm going to say it. You can put it as an epitaph on my tombstone. His district is the sixth poorest district in the United States of America out of 435 districts as of 2021, okay? The average income in his district is only $41,000. The average income in the US is $56,000. For white Americans, however, the average income is $50,000 to $56,000. For Black Americans, his district is still majority Black, it's only $28,000. Yet, some people voted for him. Some people voted for him because they knew him and they didn't know me. I have to get my name out there, and that takes time. I only started 6 months ago. But the people who voted for him and they knew about me or they knew about any other candidate, shame on them. They get what they deserve. Don't complain about when your arms get chopped off, when you lose your land, your kid goes to a bad school, or an illegal immigrant takes a job that you formerly had, or your grandkid or great-grandkid can't find a job because an illegal immigrant done took it. And I mean every word I say, by the way.
I can tell that. Obviously, the tables are not tilted in your favor. I think the most obvious representation of that was the South Carolina Democratic Party being accused of not holding debates so that Black voters didn't know that there was a Black female running for governor. How did you feel about that? As a similar somebody, I guess, in an outsider kind of position.
They did it to me. I took a vow, and so did the other candidate, Dr. Michael Addison. We both made a vow to appear for any debate. My supporters called the South Carolina Democratic Party to host a debate. They claim they don't do federal races, only local. I don't know if that's true or not. Something tells me that's not true.
Well, they didn't do the local one either, so.
I'm about to say, exactly. So my thing is this, though. There were, first of all, I'm officially protesting the election, just to let you know. Dr. Michael Addison and I. One, the administrative process we feel was unfair and biased towards Clyburn because his daughter is the Democratic Party's political director. Now, when Stacey Abrams ran against Governor Kemp, and Governor Kemp was the Secretary of State, the Democrats were foaming at the mouth and yelling until they were blue in the face about how that was corrupt and a conflict of interest. How is it that Clyburn's daughter is the state party's political director? And they claim that has no influence on the campaign. That's a lie. When I went to the state convention and they gave you the booklet, I still have it, by the way, as proof. Clyburn's ads were all throughout the booklet. Not an ad from Dr. Addison, not an ad from myself. However, Dr. Addison wrote them and asked if he could pay to get an ad put in the booklet. And Jay Promley, according to what Dr. Addison told me, never got back in contact with him. So the process was corrupt. Not only that, there are several people who I'm trying to get to sign an affidavit, but they are afraid because most of these are older people who said they did not see my name on the ballot. And too many people are saying that for me to believe they're just making it up. And these are older people. They have no reason to lie. They never even heard of me until their grandchild or kid said, hey, go vote for Marcel Dixon. And several of them in the same family said they went there and my name was not there. I hear from Republicans and Democrats that the votes, people who had their ear to the ground, that the votes were going in my favor. I'm not saying I would have won, but I definitely feel there needs to be an investigation of sort. Whether I get to that point, if these people don't sign an affidavit, I will have nothing concrete for the most part. But you know what? If I don't shine the light in that dark corner, I'm not going to probably find what I'm looking to find. But I also want to say that, yes, they should have held debates. The Democratic Party has no right to ever criticize the Republican Party for corruption. No one does corruption better than they. They pretty much protected Clyburn, and not just the Democratic Party, the media here in South Carolina, the media as well. Post and Courier, the state newspaper. I helped to rescue 2 ladies from a car accident. I have screenshots. My publicist, who of course I'm no longer his client because the contract has ended. He can tell you I sent that story to several media outlets. One reporter, she called me back right away. She was excited about the story, and then this trail just went cold. I know what that means when that happens. That means an editor who's in Clyburn's pocket killed it. When I called them, they gave me that same BS line they give everyone, that you have to give every candidate equal airtime. Really? So how come the Post and Courier gave Clyburn some article where they were pretty much his fluffer, okay, saying how 30 years he shows no signs of stopping. They didn't mention how Black Americans, Black South Carolinians have lost the majority of their property on his watch, but he's done bills to give Native Americans property. They didn't mention how he is supporting a bill to give illegal immigrants resources for housing, transportation, education, while Black Americans are 60% of the homeless, nearly 60% of this nation's homeless population. They just mentioned how he's been there for 30 years. Okay, you know what? If I put this P3 player on this table and I leave it there for 30 years, it will be there for 30 years too. That's not an accomplishment. They did so many things that showed they were biased towards him and biased against anyone running against him. Donald Trump, and I'm not necessarily a fan of Donald Trump, but a broken clock is right twice a day. He said the media is the enemy of the American people, and he was absolutely right. The crazy thing is, Black Americans have been saying that for centuries, that the media is the enemy. Who was promoting the sales of enslaved people at the markets? Who were the people posting ads to help catch runaway slaves? Who were the people helping to frame and put in a negative light civil rights activists? That was the media, and they haven't changed. And I'm talking about the liberal media, by the way. Not saying the conservative media is so much better, but the liberal media goes around saying how they're the good guys, just like the Democrats do. Please.
Yeah, I mean, our outlet definitely has, I mean, we have a split of conservative and liberal writers, which is actually something that's rare. Usually
It's very rare.
You kind of have
Right.
one or the other. I would put myself more in the libertarian category, but I'm still very happy to have a conversation with you, more because you're on the outside, you're on the fringe, and because I see that you're not getting a place to use your voice in other media outlets. And I think it's because of who you're calling out, which is Jim Clyburn, who is, of course, an institution in this state politically and even nationally.
And what does he have to show for it? His district. How can anyone celebrate that man when his district is almost the poorest place to live in the entire United States of America? If we are the most powerful country in the world, if we are somehow this world's moral center, which, give me a break, he has the poorest district, nearly the poorest district in the most powerful country in the world. Who celebrates failure? Because, and I can say this, of course you can't. He only gets away with it because he's Black, he's Southern, his father was a pastor, and he knows a lot of people up in the churches and some of these nonprofits. That's the only reason he gets away with it. If it was anyone else, they would not hesitate to call him the failure that he is. Well, guess what? I'm still going to do it. Ain't no one going to stop me from doing it either. I'm here to do what these so-called elders of mine should have done a long time ago. It's their fault, partially, that 30 years he's been in office and their kids and grandkids and great-grandkids have less homes now than they did during Jim Crow. It's their fault that we don't have the land we used to own. It's not their fault because of the anti-Blackness, but it's their fault that they kept putting this man in office who has not done a damn thing about it. So some of them are my elders. Some of them, you are just old people to me. And I want to stand by that.
And I mean, Joe Cunningham said something to the same effect. I don't know if you saw his first campaign ad he released, but he was talking about term limits, which obviously is an issue for McMaster. He's talking about age limits, and that really pissed off Clyburn's people. They went so far as to come out against that publicly, which is something that they're really kind of going out of their lane to come out against it. But it was, perceived as a direct shot at Clyburn.
First of all, I have historically spoken against term limits only because I feel it can be weaponized against a politician who actually is doing well. Nothing scares corrupt politicians more than a politician actually doing for the people, okay? That's the thing that scares them. Don't put it past them. But now my mind is starting to probably change on that. I'm still of the mindset that the people should decide how long they want a person there. But here's the thing, as you know, in this recent primary, barely 16% of the people who were eligible to vote voted, okay? So that's not the people. We're not even getting a good representation of how the people feel. And the media is implicit in that as well. They aren't promoting and letting people know these are your candidates, these are the options. They are not doing that. I also want to speak about the fact that I feel every candidate should get a report card. During my time as teaching for almost 20 years, we got report cards, okay? And I am honored to say that every year I got 5, which is the highest level you can get as a teacher. I got EVOS 5, okay? Every year I got bonuses for my student performances. If teachers could be held accountable in that regard, why are we not giving politicians report cards? There should be an entity that grades politicians. There should be an entity to measure the quality of life for your constituents. I don't give a damn how much money you got for roads in your highway. That's what Clyburn likes to do. I brought in $16 billion from South Carolina. Wow, South Carolina infrastructure is rated a D-. That's an F. And according to that study, South Carolina needs $67 billion at a minimum to just barely maintain. So $16 billion after 30 years of you being there, that ain't nothing to brag about, okay? Nothing to brag about. Politicians should get graded. They should get graded based on various factors. I believe there should be an entity that's not quite of the government, but financed by the government, such as the IRS, that grades politicians. If you get an F, you're out of there. There has to be accountability. Or I know people don't like this. I was thinking about almost voting being mandatory. You don't have to go there and vote for a person. You can easily just invalidate your ballot by just voting for everyone. There's a way to do it. But I almost feel there has to be more accountability, because what we're doing now is simply allowing corrupt people, from Mitch McConnell on the Republican side to Nancy Pelosi and Clyburn on the Democratic side. It's funny, they're quick to call out Mitch McConnell, but they don't call out the corrupt stuff they do. Nancy Pelosi hasn't had a debate in 30 years. We have to call out this almost attitude of entitlement. Like, why are you challenging them? No one's entitled to a seat. Their debate should be mandatory. I feel that every politician, mandatory, should have to do a town hall at least once a month. And they should make it where their constituents can have easy access to them. There has to be more accountability. You can look at me. I'm on Twitter all the time. I go into Twitter Spaces. I've done over 60 interviews. During my campaign, I went to restaurants, Black-owned restaurants mainly, but I was at baseball games where the crowd was majority white. I went there. I made myself accessible to all types of people. That should be mandatory. You should not be able to be a piss-poor servant of the people, but be able to hide from the people. You should be able to do a town hall where you spend 40 minutes just rambling on about nothing and 20 minutes taking the questions that you cherry pick from a box. No, it should be 2 hours, everyone sign up to get questions asked, and if you can't get to their question, you are mandated to do another one, or you are mandated to take those questions and sit in response to those people, and they can respond to you. There has to be more accountability, and right now there's none.
Yeah, I don't know how I feel about your specific solutions, as far as mandating that candidates do these things, but I do know that people feel like their representatives aren't representing them well. I mean, if you look at the approval ratings for Congress, they're at all-time low. I think because people get a sense that especially these incumbents who have been in their seats forever, there's just no real ability to knock them out, even if, as you point out, regarding Jim Clyburn, they just don't provide what their constituents need, or even make a attempt that looks like they're trying.
Feel this way. One thing I did like about Donald Trump was he was unpredictable. He wasn't diehard Republican, diehard Libertarian, diehard Green Party, diehard Democrat. He could turn on any of them, and he did. And I loved it. No one should go there being party first, okay? I love how he was shaking up everyone. Someone needs to shake the table up there, okay? Okay, someone needs to make everyone feel uncomfortable because the lives of their constituents are uncomfortable. I've had more. Let me tell you what's funny, Dylan, because I know our time's about to conclude. Let me tell you what's funny. Since the election's been over, I've had more Republicans reach out to me than Democrats. Now, I'm a reparations guy, okay? Something you may think is not popular with the Republican Party. Yet, I've had Republicans from South Carolina, Republican organizations from other places reach out to me and say, hey, man, how can we get your support? And they already know what I'm coming with. I say, look, Black Americans have lost 90% of our land. I need to get the Republican Party supposed to be all about constitutional fairness. That's a libertarian thing too. It was not fair what was done to us to cause us to lose our land. Our land was stolen from us. What do you, if you're not coming with Black specifics for the descendants of American slaves, I'm not with you. I said Black Wall Streets were burnt to the ground. Sometimes they flooded them. Sometimes they put railroads through them, highways through them. Sometimes they did eminent domain, which I know libertarians hate, but the government can just say, hey, I want your land, give it to me, bye, get out here, Negroes. That's what they did. I said, you need to do a platinum plan. Is that what Trump called it? I said, if you don't continue with a Black agenda, we done here. I've spent hours on the phone with Republicans. I've had one Democrat reach out to me, but this person is a good friend of mine, and we both are on the same wavelength, so I'm not surprised to hear from her. Not one person from the Democratic Party has reached out to me to say, what can we do to incorporate your Black agenda into our platform? But they're the party that's supposed to be for Black people. We're supposed to believe that they have our interests at heart. What policy have they done for us? I can tell you where they've sent billions of dollars to Ukraine. I can show you where they're trying to make illegal immigrants citizens, even though the data shows that illegal immigration hurts Black Americans more than any other group. I can show you where they're trying to get abortion reinstated at the federal level, even though 20 million Black babies have been murdered by abortion. Even though most Black women have said they want to keep their kids, they just want to be able to afford to have them. So let's do policies to make an economy where Black women and Black men can afford to have and raise their kids. They don't want to hear that. I've had Republicans sit down with me for hours though to talk about those things. The only Democrats that have contacted me since this election were the ones that tell me to get the hell out the party, that I'm not welcome there because I'm against abortion, because I'm against illegal immigration, because I don't want Black people getting their guns taken from them. Because if any group in this country knows that you need to be well armed, it should be Black Americans. If any group in this country should always have guns on them, it should be us. They have not mentioned a word to me about reparations. I want this message to get out to all the Black people in South Carolina and abroad. When I mention let's do things for Black people, the Democrats tell me get out of our party. But I ain't going nowhere. I'm gonna give them hell, even if I have to go to hell doing it. They are going to be held accountable to the people, Black Americans, who keep giving them our votes for 60 years, and we keep getting their behinds kissed.
Well, I respect the fact that you're not going anywhere. Anybody else who is getting, the stiff arm, whether it be from the party, the Democrat Party, the Republican Party, because they both love to give outsiders, people who are demanding that they actually represent their constituents, they love to screw those people over. So, if you're a candidate, if you're somebody who's invested in an issue, we're here to give you a voice. Obviously, you are not a conservative. The reparations agenda is not something that most Republicans would agree with, but we love to give you a voice because we see that the Democrat and Republican parties are really not fundamentally that different when you actually start to understand them at the policy level in South Carolina.
They're the same. Exactly.
And they control, or not control, but they have so many institutional ties with the people in the mainstream media in the state, whether it be the people who work at TV stations or the big papers, that they have kind of a stranglehold on the narrative of what is even able to be discussed. So you or anybody who thinks like you or even doesn't think like you, but is also getting stifled, we would love to, whether you want to submit an op-ed or whether you'd like to come on and have a conversation like this, the door's always open here at Fitz. And we really appreciate you giving us some of your time to talk about some of your ideas. Is there anywhere that you would like to point people to go if they want to learn more about you and more about the ideas that you have been talking about for the last hour?
Yes, I want to say real quick that actually have to correct you. More and more Republicans are embracing the reparations agenda. I'm trying to get the dumb Democrats to do it, because if the Republicans do it first and Black Americans go back through the Republican Party, because that was once our party, the Democrats will go extinct and they will never have a chance coming back. So I've had more Republicans, Black and white, reach out to me saying, you know what, we can probably do this reparations thing. Now, what it looks like, that's where the big conversation comes in. But if they beat the Democrats to it, the Democrats will cease to exist and they will deserve it. I do want to say I'm still taking donations for my 2024 race. So you go to marcelforcongress.com. My name is spelled Marcel. So people spell all kind of weird way. I will have to send you a redesignation letter because I'm using the same committee, but it's going from 2022 to 2024 now. But that's easy. It takes about a minute to sign. My treasurer is generating that letter now. So my platform remains the same. Repair Black America to fix America, which means all of us. If all of us aren't standing, then all of us have fallen. I want us all to stand. And that has to start with the group that still has yet to get justice for all the things that have been done to them. You know, standing my ground on that platform.
Well,
Anybody has questions? 843-940-8983. And I do text back.
Well, thank you so much for talking with us, and I look forward to speaking with you in the future and maybe even getting to meet you in person.
Thank you. I look forward to that as well. You take care.
Goodbye.